So Inside Out was an absolute classic of a film, like one of Pixar's most important works ever in my eyes. There's no denying that. Aside from Coco, at least to me, it's one of the last ever, quote unquote, true Pixar classics. And as we draw ever closer to the trailer and eventual release of the sequel, I can't help but be extremely nervous for it. More so than I think I've ever felt for any other Pixar sequel before. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think it only makes sense to dive into the history of Pixar and how that made Inside Out what it was. And you've got to start with what makes Pixar, Pixar. I think it's safe to say the Pixar formula has been crafted over close to 30 years now, as films that do something completely unique and different and tug at your heartstrings with a universal message. They don't talk down to their primary audience, and they're truly creative pieces of art. Since its inception, this is what Pixar's kind of been renowned for. From the mid-90s, Pixar managed to not only begin its animated film catalogue, but quickly grew to rival the giant that was the Disney Renaissance. And they did that not through classic fairy tale heroics, not trying to compete with Disney at their own game, but taking a look at the seemingly mundane things around us and exposing the heart of it that would otherwise be overlooked. Obviously, toys can't walk around and have grand adventures, but the relationship between children and play is very important, incredibly nostalgic. Bugs, ants, the smallest of creatures, they have their own purpose in life, no matter how small you are. Kids being terrified of monsters under the bed, and tying that in somehow with the complexities of ethical work functionality. A father struggling to cope with not being able to protect his son forever, but he's a fish. These are simplistic concepts, and yet they're universal. And they're important messages that can not only be delivered to a 5-year-old in a colourful and funny way through animation, but also shapes the way that adults reassess the way they live and work. That's the essence of classic Pixar. And so when Inside Out released, I think it really amplified all these qualities. Never before had a film that was aimed primarily towards children tackled mental health in such a direct way. It was simplistic, easy to understand, and quite moving in how it accepted that negative feelings arise and are okay. Now obviously, discourse around this topic has gotten more popular and more positive in recent years. But whilst people were kind of aware of it back in 2015, it was far and away from today's acceptance. And so at the time, there were numerous news articles praising Pixar for tackling such a serious issue head-on with tact and care and broadcasting it for a global audience. And I'm not really sure there'd been such a massive reaction outside of just praise for being awesome that Pixar's gotten before or since. I mean, maybe WALL-E had a similar reaction, but most of the time it's just praise for how good and deep and touching the films are. But this was kind of groundbreaking. It had a lot of impact, and that doesn't come along very often. And so, Inside Out's developed a really special place in a lot of people's hearts as such an exceptional film. And of course, whilst a lot of other Pixar films also have earned that special place, I think there's a greater risk in creating a sequel for this film than in comparison to something like The Incredibles or Toy Story or Finding Nemo. And I think the first reason for that is what I've just laid out: expectations and severity. Inside Out's arguably one of the deepest and most serious topics that Pixar's tackled to date. Mental health is obviously a key factor in its success, and thus it's going to be a key topic in Inside Out too. But the problem is you have to go deeper. That's the only way forward for a sequel of this topic. Otherwise, you're going to make the error of repeating the same story and turning it into a cheap cash grab. And whilst that may work from a monetary perspective, on a name brand sense, you risk tarnishing the brilliance of the film, since we know it then ends with that watered down sequel. And to me at least, that feels like a mistake that you'd hope a giant like Pixar would not make. Plus, we know for a fact that we're following the same character, Riley, which means that we're going to follow her into adolescence, which means emotions and mental health, they're only going to become more amplified, which means in turn the issues they're going to cover need to be bigger and have more depth. Now, I'm not saying that you can't cover teenage emotions in a tactful way for children to understand, but you also have to remember the initial plot. Riley becomes so completely and utterly depressed that she attempts to run away from home and she loses all semblance of hope and joy. Without her joy and sadness, she just gets filled with anger and disgust and fear. And this all culminates in pretty much a mental breakdown. And we see that encapsulated when she loses a bunch of those islands. That's pretty serious for a 12-year-old. So how do you top that? How do you go on from that? Because you have to top it, otherwise what's the point? There's no stakes if you don't. It becomes watered down, a shallow reflection of the first one. Now obviously, they're probably not going to go that much deeper into depression, right? After all, we heavily covered that in the first film, so what's the next option? Maybe anxiety? But then again, we already learned from the previous film that it's okay to accept negative emotions and not be perfect. And on top of that, it means that we have to cause even more anguish to the main character. I don't know, to me it feels like a bit of a trauma fest. On top of that, there's the general feeling that Pixar's kind of lost its spark somewhat over the last 5 years. Of course there's been enjoyable films over that time, but there seems to be an air of mild dissatisfaction. They've still yet to produce a film that's universally beloved like the Pixar heyday. Not to mention that its sequels haven't exactly been looked on favourably as of late. There's growing resentment against Toy Story 4, Lightyear, hell, even Incredibles has copped it lately, although I'll admit I did enjoy that one. The only sequels to me that stand out as truly untouchable are Toy Story 2, Toy Story 3. And whilst I don't necessarily think it's up in that category, I have seen a lot of love for Finding Dory as well. And I'll grant you that making sequels is probably very hard. It's very, very hard when its predecessor has so much love behind it. But here's the thing, and this is something that maybe Pixar doesn't quite understand yet. Sequels don't have to be made. You can just say, no, it was good, one and done. Of course, it might be easier to revisit old characters and build a story that continues on and also just cash in. But I think it very much depends on the setting and parameters of the story as to whether it's going to work. You have to strike that balance of being able to organically create problems whilst retaining the core heart and message throughout. I think the reason that the Toy Story franchise works was that it each had a simplistic issue that could be solved. And then you could add other issues down the track, different but related issues, and it still worked very well. But once you deviate from the status quo, it started to fall off. Hence the problem with Toy Story 4. Because the heart of Toy Story was Andy's bond with Woody specifically, and Woody's bond as the leader of the toys. How it's integral for Woody to be a safe anchor for Andy throughout his life, and also lead the toys in various capacities. The messages and the story change slightly throughout the films, but the heart remains the same. When Andy grows up, he releases Woody, and he gives him another child to be their anchor in whatever capacity that may be. But then in 4, you change the messaging. Woody's role is not to be that. He's no longer the leader of the toys. He's not a bond to Bonnie. It backtracks completely on Toy Story 3, and thus it feels very out of place and he just goes off with Bo Peep. It had so much of a different feel, and I think you could have told that exact story with completely fresh characters, and the vibes wouldn't change. It felt like a new storyline, and I think because of that, it stirred up a bit of discontent. Yeah, it did well financially, but I don't know, I kind of think it spoils the rest. And you can see that Inside Out will struggle to follow this formula. The main message of the film is that it's okay to feel sad, and you don't have to be positive all the time. And whilst you obviously wouldn't change that messaging, repeating it's your only other option, as you wouldn't be able to conceive a different set of issues that would lead to a different outcome. I'm not saying that it has to be specifically about happiness and sadness like the previous film was, but there will eventually have to be this push and pull of emotions, and ultimately recognition that whatever Riley's feeling, regardless of a fear of judgment, is valid. The message always has to be that it's okay to not be okay. But therein lies the problem. There's no wiggle room like there was for Toy Story. The premise is a bit more serious. Woody's role can change while still being a support for Andy, but you can't change the perspectives on acceptance of mental health. And on top of that, whilst new issues and obstacles can be constructed for Riley to face, the impact they have will be far too linear. She'll go through mental anguish again, there'll be something to prevent her other emotions from helping her out, until they conveniently can and she becomes happy or whatever again. In Toy Story, you can have Woody doubt about his role in supporting Andy, be jealous of Andy's attention, be torn over his loyalty to Andy and his friends, but at the heart of it, Andy remains the center, at least in the best sequels. Far less linear parts, but the outcome remains the same. And now, whilst I've listed many reasons as to why a sequel can't work from a creative standpoint, it's not necessarily impossible either. The obvious pathway to follow is Riley into her adolescence, and the changes she'll be facing as she develops more mature emotions and the challenges that that brings. And I'll grant you that this is a fresh issue for her to face. It's a decent and logical story to follow, and could be quite successful. But on the other hand, it comes with its own share of problems from a meta perspective. For one, it will come across as a little bit derivative of Turning Red, which is a very recent fresh installment by Pixar. So I think that going over a lot of the similar plot points wouldn't exactly be the best look, especially for an animation studio that's known as fresh and innovative and groundbreaking. But secondly, there was just massive backlash from Turning Red for delving into female adolescence and marketing it as a quote-unquote family/kids film. Now, I've made videos on Turning Red's controversy before, and I'll let you know right now that a whole bunch of the criticism, as in, well, I can't relate to this, is a whole lot of shit. Let's be honest. Many kids' films have delved into the challenges that boys experience in adolescence, and there's never been a problem with that. But 5-second references to menstruation And the world apparently loses all semblance of rationality, or at least the warriors on Twitter. Now, I'm not saying that you should shy away from those topics, but I am saying that by making this film, you're going to get that added layer of controversy surrounding it. And with Pixar's currently less than stellar track record of films, I'm not sure it's necessarily the wisest move, especially for a story that's so significant in the history of the studio. Would the backlash and the controversy be worth it? Because even if the film's good, you could end up with a situation where it gets overshadowed by the crazy people on the internet. And so more and more I'm seeing that there's just so many hoops that Pixar needs to jump through to get this sequel to be a success. More so than any sequel in the past. And whilst I do have serious doubts as to whether they can pull it off, I'll certainly be singing their praises if they do. But that's a bit of a big if for me. So I guess with all that being said, I'll throw it to you guys. Do you think Inside Out 2 is going to be a good sequel? How do you think it's going to play out? Am I worried for nothing, or do you think I'm onto something? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.